Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Ever. I'm so glad to see you all today. We have a special guest today, and I'm going to start out with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Dean Radin. Many of us have been watching Dean's videos on Ever, here and there, or on our own on YouTube, and because of that, Dean has come to speak with us on Ever about 20 years ago. Wait, I seem to have time backwards. Where does time even exist? Tomorrow, Dean would have been here in the past. So this is some kind of a concept of time that maybe we've contrived or fabricated as human beings, and maybe not, and maybe there's something completely different going on. So this is all fascinating science to me because I've recently been delving into some answers looking for answers to questions about PSI and various aspects of the field. And I've talked to a lot of people about it since I've created the sim, and there isn't a single person that I've talked to who hasn't experienced one type of experience in PSI phenomena or another. Not a single one. In fact, I talked to a big shot attorney the other day, and I mentioned this to him to get a feel for where he stood on this subject. And he stated to me he's not laughing. And when he was about 14 years old, and he's almost 70 now, he woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning for absolutely no reason. And he said his heart was racing out of his chest. And he ran around his house in the dark, not knowing why he was awake or what he was doing or why he was freaking out. About 3 or 4 hours later, first thing in the morning, he received a call, or he received a message from someone in his family that his grandfather had passed away at approximately the time he woke up in the middle of the night. So there's something going on there, even if you're not aware of it. And some of us are well educated and researching why these things happen and trying to understand more about the things that we don't understand. So today we have a very special guest with us. I'm indebted to Maggie Larimore, who's here today, and spoke a few weeks ago on Ever about slipped time concepts and experiences. And I'd like to thank Dean today for coming and taking out his very precious time, out of his very, very busy schedule to come to explain to us some of what he's discovering in this field. Dean is not garnishing a red silk scarf, pushing a crystal ball in the New York City street, but he does seem to be making a lifetime passion to try and understand what we don't yet understand. And since I'm not a professional speaker and Dean is, without further ado, I'm going to step aside and give Dean the microphone, and we will start today's presentation called Magic. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to check that everyone can hear me. I don't know how I'm going to check that. Oh, good. Okay, got it. All right, now I need to figure out a way of navigating so I can see behind me. You can tell I have not spent much time in Second Life. So I'm probably best known for my research on parapsychology and psi phenomena. And by the way, it's not PSI. PSI in engineering terms means pounds per square inch. And instead, we just use the word psi, which is a letter in the Greek alphabet, which is the first letter in the word psyche, meaning mind or soul. So it's just psi. So I've been doing research in this field for about 30 years, mostly in a laboratory. There's an international society of scientists and scholars who are interested in this topic called the Parapsychological Association, and I've been president of that 4 times over the past 25 years or so. So I've written several books on psi phenomena. So because I'm a scientist, I've been working on the science of looking at psychic phenomena or psi phenomena. Most of the books that I've written are on laboratory tests of telepathy and precognition and those sorts of things. And it's possible now to say with very high confidence, scientific confidence, that the phenomena exist. When you start to look at the context of these phenomena, you immediately bump into ideas that are from religious concepts. And you go further expansion, you end up with concepts of magic. And so I'm now working on a book about linking together ideas in magic and religion and science. That's where this topic comes from. So I call this Magic 2.0, perhaps thought of as a form of reality hacking. And there are three major ways, or three major meanings of the word magic when people think about it. The first is fictional magic, Harry Potter, and that sort of thing. When you look at the most books that have been sold and the highest rated movies in terms of box office, it's all Harry Potter. And when you look at the next batch of books and movies, every single one of them has to do with magical and mystical themes. All of them do. So it's an indication that while from a scientific perspective people kind of laugh at the idea that real magic, or especially Harry Potter magic, is real, from a popular perspective, it is very clear that people are interested in these ideas. Second major category is what I would call fake magic or feigned magic, which is performances, illusions, like Harry Houdini would do and many other magicians today. And this was making the concepts of magic visible for people, but of course using tricks. And this too is very popular. The third type of magic that people think of is fraud, phony magic. So this is a cartoon character whose name is Madame Zodiac. It's kind of the stereotype of a fraudulent psychic. Some of you may remember that in the United States there was a phone psychic scam that was run for many years, and the spokeswoman was Miss Cleo. They were able to get $500 million from people over doing psychic readings over the phone. Some of the people doing the readings may have been legitimate psychics, but on the whole, the project was considered a scam because it was said that you can get a free psychic reading and people were charged for it anyway. So by the time they were shut down, they had gotten $500 million from people. And then there are a number of individual cases. There's a case in Oregon where a psychic and her daughter scammed an elderly man of $15 million, his entire estate, by faking psychic readings. So these are the three major categories of magic. I'm going to talk about is real magic, and it basically is taking ideas which were once considered supernatural and making them natural. This, by the way, is what science has done from the very beginning. So from the beginning, if we go back far enough, perhaps 10,000 years ago, everything was considered to be supernatural because people didn't have explanations for anything. Eventually, around the Renaissance, the 15th and 16th century, the idea of science came along and slowly began to turn supernatural ideas into natural magic. It was originally called natural magic, so like magnetism was seen as something that wasn't divine, wasn't from the gods, but it nevertheless was a regularity. And this gave rise to the idea of laws in science. They're just based on things that are regular. And eventually we've begun to figure out what things like magnetism and electromagnetism are. And that's no longer considered natural magic, but that's what it was called. So this next slide here is showing that aspects of natural magic, originally alchemy, astrology, and herbalism, eventually became the disciplines that we know today, chemistry, astronomy, and the pharmaceutical business. But there's a fourth domain of mental magic, which, if you haven't yet seen the movie Doctor Strange, you must see it. So we're going to talk here about mental magic, because ultimately that's what Harry Potter magic is all about. This does not actually reduce the mental side of alchemy, astrology, and herbalism. What chemistry does, and what astronomy and the pharmaceutical world do, is look purely at the physical side of alchemy, astrology, and herbalism, but all three of those domains also have mental components to them. So I'm splitting out mental now because it's really about consciousness. What is the capacities of consciousness? That's where a Doctor Strange kind of magic happens. So real magic consists of three parts. There's divination, exercise of the will or force of will, and theurgy, otherwise known as necromancy, which is invoking spirits or non-physical intelligences and getting them to do things on your behalf if you're lucky, and getting into serious trouble if you're not so lucky. This is what real magic is about. And then this next slide shows that from an academic point of view, we look at history as a sequence that goes from magic through religion to science. So one of the early anthropologists who looked at magic and what they would at that time would call the savages or primitives, George Fraser was the guy's name. So James Fraser was one of the first anthropologists, and the beginning of anthropology was studying magical beliefs. So you start here on the left with the quote, savage. That gets codified into religion. And then we have science. So this is this evolution that is the academic way of thinking about it. But the actual way of looking at it is closer to this, that you have this wall separating a gigantic amount of science out there, which is the arbiter of truth today, and you have a little piece of magic on the other side of the wall and a slightly larger piece of religion. And that's it. So there's a wall that separates us. That's not exactly the way it actually is. The way that we can really think of it is more like this. That we have religion, we have science, they don't mix very well, and behind both of them is this massive domain of magic. And it's very easy to show that there's a direct connection between magic as a practice. There's a way of thinking of magic is that magic is to religion as technology is to science. In other words, magic is the practice of religious ideas, technology is the practice of scientific ideas. And magical thinking is everywhere. So here are some popular superstitions. The one on the bottom right here says, don't take pictures of three people side by side, because in some countries in Asia that will mean that one of those three people are going to die. So you don't do that. And these are superstitions because there's no connection between the activity and the outcome. And in many ways, that is what magical thinking is about. It's the notion that something happens and we don't know why. Okay, so here's some other popular superstitions. Coins in a fountain, the evil eye, the Ganesha statue, or four-leaf clover. You find these in every culture, everywhere in the world. Here are some other practices that people do. You can think of them as superstitious, but there are various forms of prayer. Bottom right, you have Hindus for Trump. And apparently, in this case, the Hindu prayers work better than the Christian, the Catholic, or on the lower left, you can't see it, but it's Islamic prayer. Here is the Catholic Eucharist, and this is explicitly magic because it involves transubstantiation, the turning of wine and bread, literally in the Catholic faith, into the blood and body of Jesus. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that the Protestant Reformation began, because some Christians who were Catholic at the time got very upset that there were pagan rites being performed within Christianity. And the pagan rites, as they saw, were these magical procedures. Transubstantiation is explicitly magic. Oh, and by the way, it's okay for magic to be performed if you're given permission by the church, namely if you're a priest, but otherwise it is strictly forbidden. Religion completely believes in magic, but it also violently bans it. So here on the left you have the Malleus Maleficarum, sometimes called the witch's hammer, which was the first book that was supported by the Pope at the time and gave the right for the Inquisition to prosecute witches. And so there are roughly 300 years and several 100,000 people who were burnt at the stake or tortured for being a witch. The vast majority of them probably had absolutely nothing to do with witchcraft, and it simply became a horrific period in history where anybody for any reason could be accused as a witch, and sometimes they were, not sometimes, probably most of the time, they're completely innocent. So this is an aspect of terror that was used by the traditional religions to suppress interest in witchcraft. And even today, you can find these are Christian cartoons that are saying, among other things, in the upper left there, that God hates witchcraft and it was a crime punishable by death. In the middle picture, there's a girl who has a spirit in her, and Jesus' name come out of her. It comes out, and she says, "Oh, what happened, Uncle Bob? Everything has changed. I feel different." An hour later, "Tell me, Samantha, how did you and Holly get into the craft?" By which he means witchcraft. And the answer is through the Harry Potter books. We wanted his powers, so we called for spirit guides, and they came into us. So here we have this strange circumstance where Harry Potter books have sold hundreds of millions, earning billions of dollars. It is also the #1 most banned book. So we have this very strong push-pull out there. People are strongly attracted to that kind of story, and at the same time, the most banned book because of religious reasons. Unfortunately, the persecution of witches has not stopped. This is an article from the New York Times just a couple of years ago showing that in many countries around the world, many in the Arabic countries and in northern Africa, there are people who are persecuted and either burnt or stoned for being witches. So this terror, this fear, is still strongly out there. It has even occurred in the United States. Not too much burning, but people going to prison. On the other side now, we have science that denies even the existence of magic. It's okay that alchemy became chemistry and so on, but when you look at the couple of books out there that have tried to explain the science of Harry Potter, or as Richard Dawkins, the militant atheist, says, a magic of reality, the word magic that they're using is in the form of a superlative, an adjective, and not in terms of traditional magic as we would think of it. You notice in the book on the left, The Science of Harry Potter, how magic really works. What he does in there is try to cast ideas from Harry Potter, like flying on a broomstick, and saying, with existing technology, how could we do that? Which, from my perspective, is interesting, but it's also completely misses the whole point. It is not how magic really works. It is not current technology. It is a technology of consciousness. And here we have Michael Shermer, who's the publisher of Skeptic magazine, and skeptics generally do not like this topic at all. He also writes a column in Scientific American, and a couple of years ago he wrote about an event that he said was so remarkable that it shook his skepticism to the core. As he says below, he's often asked if he's encountered anything he couldn't explain, and his answer is now, yes, I have. And this was a startling admission on his part, because as the voice of American skeptics, they have uniformly denied that anything paranormal, mystical, supernatural can occur. And yet he said at this point that, yeah, there was something that had it, and he said it in Scientific American. So I'm not going to go into the details, but basically it was, on the top here, it's showing putting batteries into a radio. It's the grandfather's radio that hadn't worked in many years, and they tried to get the radio to work, and it didn't work. And he and his fiancée got married, and suddenly the radio started working and playing the songs of the grandfather, and this made the fiancée, or at that time the wife, very sad, because she had hoped her grandfather would be at the wedding, and he had died. So the radio played. It turned on by itself, it played his favorite song, and then it stopped playing and it never worked again. So obviously both Michael and his new wife were very shocked at this because of the meaningful coincidence. And as he says here, that if we're to take seriously the scientific credo to keep an open mind, then we should not shut the doors of perception, however strange they may seem. So that was 2014. 2 years later, he writes this, again in his column in Scientific American: is it possible to measure supernatural or paranormal phenomena? We must resist the temptation because such efforts can never succeed. This is just 2 years after he had this remarkable experience, and he does what many people have done, which is to erase the experience. He completely suppresses it. He doesn't repress it because then it would be unconscious, but he consciously pushes it away. And in this case, he's going on much stronger than usual skepticism, because he's saying here that it is impossible. We can never succeed at doing this, which, from my perspective, is an anti-scientific perspective. And I'm actually surprised that they allowed this to be published in Scientific American. But there you have it. The other thing that happens is that you have some people who are famous scientists. Here we have Jack Parsons, who's one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. So at JPL, Jack Parsons was one of the people who developed rocket engines. He was also a magician, a practicing magician, who would go out into the desert and do ceremonial magic. And he claimed that some of his insights came through that practice, and he has been written out of the history of NASA. You will not find anything about Jack Parsons in there anymore, as a result, because it's embarrassing to people in the mainstream. But by the same token, if you look at the history of all of our great figures, yes, someone mentions Parsons was a close friend of L. Ron Hubbard, and it's related to Scientology, and yet another reason for not mentioning Parsons. So here we have people like Paracelsus, Newton, Bruno, Swedenborg. All of these were the origins of our ideas of physics and medicine, the neurosciences, astronomy, and so on, and mathematics. All of them were also practicing magicians. Newton wrote much more on alchemy than he did on scientific ideas. Bruno, of course, well known as a scientific hero. He was also a practicing magician and alchemist. So these are ideas that are usually not written in the stories of these scientific pioneers. So we have two traditions. We have a scientific tradition, and these are disciplines like anthropology, history, sociology, psychology, and psychiatry, all of which take a perspective on real magic as false beliefs, as ancient ideas, as magical thinking, mental illness. Almost everything that you see, and especially what you see in textbooks, like Psychology 101 textbooks in college, they're polemics. They are either religious or scientific texts which basically say that magic is false and dangerous, and that there's no scientific evidence for any of it. So now we switch over to this other tradition, people who are practicing magicians. They completely agree that magic exists. They use it. There are all kinds of cultural variations in it. There are certain commonalities that you see in magical traditions. That's what I'm writing about in my book, is making a synthesis, essentially, of all of these magical traditions. And there are experimental and practical methods used in magic. But even among magicians, you almost uniformly find that they say that magic is impossible to scientifically test. And so in both cases now, the academic tradition, both science and scholarship and religion, and people who are practicing magicians are saying there's no evidence for this from a scientific perspective, so it will always remain either suppressed or outside the domain of science. Both of those points are wrong. And you're just emphasizing it here. Scientists, theists, academics, and magicians all say no, magic doesn't exist. Even J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter book, says, I absolutely do not believe in the occult. I'm sure she just said that because otherwise people were accusing her of being a closet occultist. Somebody's asking, are shamans a category of magicians? Absolutely, yes. So we have so much for magic, except for a small problem. The problem is that the major claims of magic, divination, power of will, and theurgy, have been scientifically tested for about 150 years. For divination, it involves clairvoyance and precognition. Power of will is psychokinesis, and theurgy is mediumship and several other domains of a category about survival of consciousness. So all of these have been tested. So again, part of the book I'm writing is to show how these have been tested. And so my first book there in the lower left, I was simply saying, well, how would science go about testing these kinds of phenomena? The core of the scientific method is you have a theory that you think may explain something. You then do experiments to test it, and if the experiments must be repeatable by independent people, otherwise you have no no reason to believe that they might be true. So the conscious universe goes into great gory detail about how we know that certain psychic effects are real because they're repeatable independently. After that book, a lot of people said, well, but how do you explain these things? So the second book is talking about, from a physics perspective, especially modern physics, are these kinds of phenomena incompatible with what we know about the physical world? And the answer is, it is incompatible with what we knew in the 17th century, but it is not incompatible with what we know in the 21st century. And so about half of the book, Entangled Minds, describes what I mean by that. What do I mean by not being incompatible? Third book is one of the esoteric practices, namely yoga, in which what amounts to magical powers or magical abilities are produced, and they're mainly produced through meditation. In the yogic tradition, they're called siddhis, but in the magical tradition, it would just be called one of the magical powers. So in doing these books here, what I was doing essentially was first looking just at the core of scientific methods and expanding it into physics, and then expanding it out into one of the forms of practice that used it. And so the book I'm writing now on magic is expanding out this idea even further into the esoteric traditions, which are where magic basically has hidden all these years, for 10,000 years or so. So it's from this effort that this book on magic will show that real Harry Potter type magic exists. In most people it is extremely weak, and yet even being weak, if you look into what's happening today, and I'll have a few slides of this later, there are thousands of books that are published all the time now in the category of self-help. A good deal of what is talked about in those books is magic. It's just said in different terms. So part of the issue from a science perspective is that, well, how do we know what to believe in this? And so I can say all kinds of things and write books, and I'm reasonably sure that what I'm writing is correct, but the one domain of science that is specializing in the analysis of data is statistics. So I'm showing here a picture of Jessica Utz. She is the chair of the statistics department at the University of California at Irvine. She is also the current president of the American Statistical Association. And in this past July in Chicago, there was this meeting, the Joint Statistical Meetings, which brings together all of the world's largest statistical organizations. And as the president of the American Statistical Association, she was invited to give an address. So this is what she said as part of her address. Remember, she's now talking to 3,000 professional academic statisticians in the audience, and she says this: for many years, I've worked with researchers doing very careful work in this area, meaning psi research, including a year that I spent full-time working on a classified project for the United States government to see if we could use psychic abilities for intelligence gathering during the Cold War. Well, I met Jessica 30 years ago on that project because I was on the project at the time, and that's when I first met Jessica. Since she was asked by U.S. Congress on behalf of the CIA to analyze data on remote viewing and precognition for the government, since they were funding it, her conclusion was that the strength of the evidence is strong enough that if this were any other topic, it would have long ago been accepted as real. And that's her conclusion today. It remains the same, that if you look at the data from a neutral perspective, from the idea of looking at statistics, then there's no question that these abilities exist. So from the point of view of arguments or debates between scientists who are proponents of these ideas and skeptics generally who don't know anything about it, that debate is over. This is a false equivalency when you have a debate between professionals who are saying, yes, this is real, and others who are saying it's not. It's very similar to something like the denial of climate change. You have the vast majority of people who know what they're talking about saying something strange is happening in the climate, and yet you have others who are totally denying it. Well, we have a problem. Here, what I'm talking about then is you look at the esoteric traditions. And so we have the Hermetic tradition, the Gnostics, and so on. This is simply the Kabbalistic tradition. The symbol on the bottom, which shows 1 through 10, is from the Kabbalistic perspective the way that intention, consciousness, manifests into the world as we see it. So you start at the very top, and it goes to these various domains, 10 different domains, and you end up manifesting the world as we see it. Here's the Hermetic tradition. On the right, you have the thing called the Emerald Tablet. It probably isn't an emerald, but it looks like an emerald, and it has embossed on it, on one single tablet, the entire Hermetic tradition. So there are many books written about the interpretation of this, and basically it's echoing what you see in the Kabbalah and what you see in all of these other traditions, just said in a different way. Here we have Neoplatonic cosmology. If you remember your Plato from philosophy, his notion was that there are forms out there that are somehow the elemental ideas of the way things work. Well, a couple millennia after Plato, the new philosophers took up this idea, which is why it's called Neoplatonic, and they came up with cosmology, where ultimately you start with consciousness, and as you do in the Kabbalah and in Hermeticism, that consciousness manifests eventually into the world as we see it. And this is exactly why those traditions are where magic comes from. You also have the mystery schools. Mystery schools in Egypt, you have one in Greece, you have the new one, the Jedi Mystery School, and many others. In the ancient days, the mystery schools were open generally to anyone. This was unusual for the hierarchical societies of the day, but everyone from the highest ranking patricians to slaves could attend the mystery schools. But the mystery schools generally had 2 categories. So only high-ranking people could go to the high schools, and the higher mystery schools would not simply teach about life after death, which is one of the core topics of the mystery schools, but they would give people an experience of life after death. And the history shows, I think, pretty clearly that the way they did that was through psychedelic drugs. We now understand from the description of those drugs approximately which psychedelics they were using. I don't know if the Jedi mystery schools can use drugs. I hope not. Then we have the Gnostic tradition. So the Gnostic Gospels were known in the 2nd to 4th century, but they became really interesting in the 1940s with the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels at Nag Hammadi. In Egypt, I believe, in a cave. They found ancient scrolls which were what amounts to the remaining hidden scrolls of the Bible. They should have been in the Bible because they're written about the same time and by the same people, and it's all about Gnosticism, and it was left out. So from here, you now jump out into the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it is not entirely clear why or how Rosicrucianism began in Germany, but this is a tradition that goes back into the Middle Ages and is still popular today with many people as one of the esoteric teachings. Here you have the Freemasons. Freemasons began around the same time as the Rosicrucians. Originally were the Masonic Guild. There literally were Masons who were building churches and things and castles. For reasons that is not entirely clear, even to the Masons, this became an esoteric society, and it's certainly old. It's not secret though, because anybody can join it. What the secret part is the esoteric tradition. And in today's world, you can go on the internet and find virtually anything about any tradition ever. So it's no longer secret. I'm showing you at the top there is that Masons are in India, and the bottom they're also in Islamic countries. They're everywhere. Then we have Mesmer. So Mesmer is important because Mesmer was during the height of the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, and he was basically working with hypnosis, with some magical ideas, and cast it out of esoteric notions and into scientific notions. So we have the word animal magnetism, and it's a bad translation because the word animal doesn't mean animals. It means more along the lines of life force. So his notion was that there's some kind of a life force which acts in a magnetic way. And that was the best description that he had at the time because nobody else knew what to call it. So he developed mesmerism. It was extremely effective on many people for all kinds of different things. But he was investigated by the scientists of the day, the French Academy, and the first investigation said there's no magic in here at all. It might have effects on people's physiology, but it's all completely due to expectation. So they basically trashed mesmerism. There was a second, this was now almost 20 years later, there was a second commission of the French Academy that was completely the opposite. It was very positive, but nobody remembers that. So Mesmer's ideas went throughout Europe and it finally made it to the United States. But before we get to the United States, we're showing here that within Britain in the 1880s, you have the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a revitalization of ancient ceremonial magic. And this is one of the first times that you had organizations get together and do ceremonial magic, some of which was new, some were new ideas that they're pulling together. From the Hermetic, from the Golden Dawn, you have people who are inspired like Madame Blavatsky, who developed Theosophy. And Theosophy is very important because it not only took the Western esoteric ideas, but also drew in the Eastern ones and created a synthesis of what was known at the time as the secret doctrine or esoteric ideas. And obviously now it's not so secret because she wrote the book. Mary Baker Eddy is what happened, among others, when mesmerism made it to the United States. So you had people who learned about mesmerism, came to the United States, became healers. At the time, it was being thought of as faith healing. But they were very effective at it. They're using combinations of hypnosis, of faith healing, of expectation, of placebos, maybe a little magic thrown in. And in Mary Baker Eddy's case, she had been very ill for a very long time and was cured by a guy named Phineas Quinby, who was one of the early people using mesmerism to heal people. So she was so impressed with this that she worked with Quinby for a while and then developed her own version of this kind of healing in a Christian context, and that's the origins of Christian Science. Roughly at the same time, you have Aleister Crowley in the UK, who is a provocateur and a magician. And while he was not particularly liked by polite society at the time, because a lot of what he was doing was explicitly pushing against what was considered to be polite society. So he did nasty business. But his approach to magic was, I think you could say, is the first modern approach, because he emphasized really hard that you should, that first of all, magic is real, you need to study and practice it, and you need to take a scientific approach. So he repeatedly would say that you need to write down every time you do a spell or a magical ceremony, check it and track it and see what works and what doesn't work. He was also one of the first to recognize that there was something about modern physics, which at his time was just beginning to be known, but it was modern physics was pointing in a direction which would eventually allow magic to be real, or at least to be real from a scientific perspective. At about the same time, you have Gurdjieff and Ouspensky writing their own version, more from a Russian perspective or an Eastern European perspective, a way of enlightenment, which also comes directly out of the esoteric traditions. And then in the 1970s, you have Peter Carroll's version of chaos magic, which has been described as a mashup of punk rock, science fiction, science, and ceremonial magic all squished together. So chaos magic actually, like Aleister Crowley, Peter Carroll's original work is really interesting because he's absolutely thinking of it as a science, using scientific principles, mostly in physics, and strips away all of the ancient ceremonial ideas of the use of that you need robes and you need special altars and you need all of this need basically is left over from the medieval times. And so he stripped down magic almost to its bare essence. And actually some of what I'm writing about in my own book now is taking chaos magic and even simplifying it further. Here you can find this nice field manual, the Psychonaut field manual online. It's a PDF you can download. Just look up Psychonaut field manual in Blue Fluke and you'll get this very nice graphic novel which again, is coming more out of the chaos magic tradition and simplifying it even further as a graphic novel. So this brings us up to mostly in the United States, but these books have been published in basically every other language. You have channeled information like Course in Miracles and Seth Speaks. You have very popular things like The Secret and Dale Carnegie and Napoleon Hill. All of these are talking about magical principles. They're talking about affirmations, about the exercise of will to make your world create itself. The notion of you create your own reality is from this tradition, which has a direct lineage all the way back into medieval and even ancient magic. What you're beginning to see now is more and more books from a medical perspective. So I have here Mind Over Back Pain by John Sarno, Mind Over Medicine by Lisa Rankin. They're both MDs. They both have done a very good job in taking away all of the esoteric ideas and not talking about it at all, hardly, but showing that certain kinds of back pain is completely mental. You change your idea about it and you no longer have chronic back pain, even severe back pain. And not only that, other kinds of treatments as well. And Lissa does a very similar thing, that a lot of what we think of as medical problems originate in the mind and can be cured in the mind itself. So this is essentially what Phineas Quimby was doing 150 years ago, and what led to the cure of Mary Baker Eddy. This is just brought up to date. A good book which summarizes this whole way of how this is manifested in the United States was One Simple Idea by Mitch Horowitz. It's a good summary of how these ancient notions were reshaped by the pragmatism of the United States. And all of the esoteric parts are stripped away, but the origins of it goes all the way back to shamanism, basically. So in this one, there's a perennial philosophy of magic, but it's actually just the perennial philosophy. It is very simple. It's space, time, and mind all emerge from a magical wording. They emanate or they manifest from one mind. Said in another way, consciousness is fundamental. That is the perennial philosophy. It's the basis of mystical experience, the basis of all religions, that there's some consciousness with a big C or a little c or something like that, which is more fundamental than the physical world. That's essentially what the Kabbalah says as well. So this is where then the three major categories of magic come from. Force of will is that mind or consciousness can manipulate reality because it's more fundamental than reality. Divination, mind or consciousness can know everything because it's connected to everything and it makes everything. And theurgy is a reminder that physical embodiment in human form is just one form that mind can take. And so there may be an infinite number of other forms that can hold a mind, either in physical or non-physical form. And so the notion of theurgy is getting in contact with those kinds of embodiments, which may not be physical. In all of the magical traditions, you have certain factors which modulate how good or how strong the magic manifests. It's all about intention, about belief, emotion, imagination, ritual, and talent. That's basically it. If those things are operating on all 8 cylinders, then you get really strong magic. For most people, they're missing one or more of those things, which is why magic in most people is not very strong. So here's like a cartoon or a metaphor way of thinking about what's going on. You have your conscious awareness. It's what we call in physics the classical domain of space and time. There's a feeling that things are separate and that observers don't interact with the physical world. Obviously, if I look at you, I will interact with you, but that's because you can see me looking at you. If I look at a rock or I look at my cell phone, it is thought in the classical domain that my looking at it does not change it. That's what we mean by observer independence. So now we'll go a little bit deeper. We look what looks like an iceberg and a little island, we actually now see is just one gigantic iceberg. As soon as you go below the surface, you're in the domain of the unconscious, of mystical union, of gnosis, which all means the same thing. Gnosis, mystical union, samadhi, they're all words for the same thing. Just below the surface of the classical domain is the quantum domain, We know, both theoretically and experimentally now, that there is complete interconnectedness. It's a holistic domain. It is observer-dependent, and it exists outside of space and time. If you go even further, you end up with a post-quantum domain, which is at the leading edge of physics today. Our language does not describe it very well. Even the mathematics are very abstract. And as best as we can understand at this point, it's purely informational. It's a domain that we would describe today as information only, not physical, just information. And so from that perspective, you think about why it is said in magical traditions that your imagination gives rise to the world, because imagination starts at these very, very deep levels of reality, which is not physical. It's in some kind of informational space. So you imagine something, you do the right kinds of rituals, eventually it rises up into the classical domain and manifests here. That's the essence of how magic works, at least the manifestation side of magic. So I'm going to wrap up here with two experiments that we did, which were not cast in terms of magic, but they illustrate some of the ideas underneath magic. And this is talking about, does intention really influence the world at large? And in particular, does belief modulate that influence? Both of which, the first one is force of will, the second one is a modulation of force of will. And we did it in the context of the Chinese tea ceremony, because the tea ceremony is an explicitly intentional act. It is all about, it's not simply making tea, it's making tea with intention. So here's how we did it. I have a colleague who is in Taiwan. The circle there is showing him. He belongs to a Buddhist temple, has 200 members in the temple, and he asked the 3 senior monks at the temple, who are in front of him there, to do an experiment, to which they agreed. And the experiment was that they would use their force of will to bless tea. So here's a flow chart of the experiment. In the upper left, we created a big batch of oolong tea, separated it into two pitchers. One pitcher on the right was blessed by the monks intentionally, so that anybody who drank that tea would have elevated mood. They would feel less fatigue and more vigor. They also put in what we can think of as an anti-blessing on the tea on the left, which was the control tea, specifically designed to not have the blessing. Because if you bless tea and there's other tea around, it might accidentally pick up that blessing. So we wanted to prevent that. So they blessed the one batch of tea and they protected the other tea so it would not be blessed. Then the tea was put into little bottles. The bottles were distributed to 100 people in a double-blind fashion. So 100 people got the treated tea, and 100 got the blessed tea, and 100 got the controlled tea. Then they were asked to record their mood each day over the course of a week, and to see if the people who got the blessed tea, even under double-blind conditions, did their mood improve, because that was the point of the experiment. So this shows the result. Well, the first thing that we asked people was, when they finished the experiment over the end of the week, what did they think about what they were drinking? What was their belief? So we asked, did you think you were drinking treated tea? Or did you think you had the untreated tea? Or did you not know? So this separates them by their belief in what they were drinking. And as you see here, this is a very classic placebo effect. So people who believed that they were drinking treated tea, regardless of what they were drinking, their mood did improve significantly. People who believed that they were not getting the treated tea, their mood stayed exactly the same. And people who didn't know, it improved a little bit. So this is the placebo effect right there. And now to see whether the treatment actually did anything, you go into this condition. This is the placebo control. Everyone in this graph believed that the tea was treated. Some of them actually did get the treated tea, but some of them also got untreated tea. And as you see that the two curves deviate, they deviate significantly eventually, it's showing that people who got the treated or the blessed tea actually got better mood than the ones who did not. So this is a placebo control. It shows that the intentional treatment worked. If you believe that you're getting a treated tea and you actually do get it, you had a better mood than people who did not get the treated tea, even though they believed they could. Someone is saying you can't hear the presentation. Oh, yeah, it's in the voice. Okay, so that was the placebo control. This is now called the nocebo control. These are people, all of whom believe that no one of these people believes that the tea is treated. Some do get the treated tea and some don't. And in this case, there's no difference at all in their mood. So what this means is that if you don't believe, then the magic doesn't work. That's essentially what this says. And that is said in every magical tradition, too. You must believe that the spell is going to work, otherwise you block it from working. And that's exactly what this nocebo control shows. There's a third condition where people didn't know. They don't know if they're drinking treated tea or not, and there's no difference. They're all elevated a little bit, but there's no difference in actually getting the real tea or the control tea. So here's a different kind of experiment. This one came about as a result of studying mediumship. So Marley's asking, is it mostly one's belief or the actual effect of the tea? And the answer is it's both. It is the blessing combined with the belief is what makes it work. That's what that says. And that's what is said in all the magical traditions as well. That the magic works if you believe that it's going to work. And I'm talking about the magician. It's himself or herself. But it also works in terms of the people who are receiving the thing which was magical. So one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of magic today is because people don't, especially in Western secular world, they don't believe that magic exists, and it actually suppresses the result. So here we're looking at this slide, 6 people, 3 of whom are alive and 3 are dead. And we did an experiment testing the claims of mediums who claim that they talk to dead people, and they're able to look at a photograph and get a sense as to whether the person's alive or dead. They get a different feeling from the photograph. So we did the following experiment to test that idea. This fits into the notion of theurgy, which is that there's some kind of non-physical relationship with people who are not alive. So the idea of this test is you sit somebody down to look at one picture at a time. There are 400 pictures. The pictures were all designed in such a way that they were the face was in the same size in each picture. It was turned into a grayscale, so there's no indication of the color of the skin. The direction that somebody was looking, whether looking at the camera or looking to the side, if they're smiling or not smiling, if they had a certain hairdo or not a hairdo, all of these were matched so that there were, at the end, 400 pictures, 200 of which were people who were alive and 200 are people who were dead, but matched on 8 different characteristics. So there's no clues by simply looking at the picture whether the person was alive or dead. We then had invited 12 mediums to the laboratory, and one by one they went through each one of the pictures and selected did they think they were alive or dead. And overall they got a significant success rate. It wasn't great. It was 53%, where you'd expect only 50% by chance, but that is statistically significant. So this is an important book here. This came out just recently. It's published by the American Psychological Association, which is like the mainstream psychology today. And it says, among other things in here, we're in the midst of a sea change. Receding from view is materialism. Approaching our sights is a complete reversal of perspective. According to this alternate view, consciousness is primary and the physical is secondary. Well, this idea that consciousness is fundamental in some way is the Perennial Philosophy. It's the essence of magic. And the fact that this book is published is not particularly surprising because there are a lot of books of that type, but that it's published by the American Psychological Association is very important because it means that even within the academic world today that this kind of idea is no longer taboo. It is possible to write this and have it published by mainstream psychology. So that brings us to this. Someday you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And I thank you for your kind attention. So that's, I think that was the last slide. When I do it, thank you. So there you have it. There's magic.
thank you very much, Dean. Will you be taking questions today, or do you need a short
Sure.
break? Or
No, we can go ahead. I want to change my perspective so I can look around. Let's
okay.
see.
If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to type it in local chat or blurt out in voice. And we'll look at local chat and see if you have anything to type, or we'll listen for a few minutes to see if you have any questions. In the meantime, I have a question, Dean.
Sure.
It's an odd question, but maybe of interest to some. Have you ever heard in your research of anyone seeing images on their eyelids, as opposed to by being awake, as opposed to dreaming in a state of sleep?
You mean with their eyes closed?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a technique that's used in the laboratory to encourage people to go into a hypnagogic state without actually falling asleep. So, yes. And it's, you know, where the image actually is, it's in your head. It's not in your eyelids. But yeah, some people can get very vivid imagery in their head that way. Somebody asked, do I know about Real Magic by Bonowitz? And the answer is yes. There's two other books with that title. One is by Bonowitz, and the other, I had it, but it just escaped me. There's one other book by that name. And of course, there are many, many books like along the lines of The Secret and about affirmations, which are really magic, but they don't talk about it in those terms. Right. So what about the vampire lore, the zombies, exorcism, telepathy? As a theme, the entertainment industry has always used these themes. They used to be more in the B-movie domain, but also science fiction just uses these ideas again and again in very many different contexts. And it just reflects, from my perspective, it reflects that we have an intuitive sense that there's something about magical ideas or the esoteric ideas that are true. It's just that in a modern Western scientific society, we're not allowed to talk about it in the form of it being true, so it comes out in other ways. And it's coming out through things like Harry Potter books and movies like Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange, by the way, just became Marvel's #1 highest grossing movie beyond Iron Man. So it shows that people are resonating with this concept in ways that even surprise Marvel. So if someone's asking, do I differentiate between being neutral in belief but open as being opposed? So in parapsychology, the effects of belief have shown that if you're strongly in favor of an idea, you tend to get positive results. And if you're strongly against or skeptical of an idea, you get results in the opposite direction. So your belief, that's why I say that your belief seems to modulate the effect of intention. And it is also, in all those magical traditions, talk about the reason why sorcery is often done in complete secrecy is so that you don't have anybody else's intentions or beliefs that will get in the way. I believe that magic can be instrumental in contacting those persons who have passed away on this earth. Well, that's what mediums claim. Most of the mediums I've met don't think of it in terms of magic, but it is from that tradition. So I think one of the things I'll try to do in my book is to reduce the fear associated with the occult connotation of magic, because all occult means is hidden, which means exactly the same as esoteric. And there's a lot of fear about that, which comes out of the religious traditions. So it's simply magic, like anything else, will eventually become part of natural science. We just don't have a good name for it yet. What's the difference in communicating with dead people and alive people who are not present? My experience has been in such connection, you're connecting with soul anyway, and soul exists beyond body. That is something that mediums will say. Yeah. So communicating with dead people, well, dead people are not embodied, and alive people are embodied. So there's an obvious difference. What is not known, at least from the experimental work, is if you're communicating with somebody who is deceased and getting information that could be verified from them, does that mean that they exist separate from you? And this has been so far impossible to figure out how to test that notion experimentally. Mediums will claim, of course, that they're talking to some independent entity out there, but whether that is true or whether that's their experience, we have no answer yet because we haven't figured out how to test it. And people have been trying for 150 years, so we don't know the answer yet. Oh, yeah, so I'm reminded to discuss a current study and perhaps recruit some volunteers. So one of the studies we're doing now is looking at the very common lore that psychic ability runs in families. You will often find, we often find, among mediums, certainly among people who are psychics as well, that they will say, if we ask them, has anyone else in your family ever report this stuff? And they'll say, yeah, my aunt so-and-so or my grandmother or something like that. So we're doing a study of genetics now of psychic ability and recruiting people who have a history of psychic ability within their family. We ask them to take 2 questionnaires, which get at the history, and then to do a test online that we have to gauge how good the psychic ability actually is. And if you make it into being one of the candidates, you will be asked to, we'll send you a saliva collection tube, which you basically spit into the jar and you mail it back to us. We send it off to a lab at Stanford University, and they do a full genome analysis. And we will then compare people who report these abilities versus people who don't. And even at this early stage, the ability to get a full genome now is not too expensive, and there are lots of new ways of looking at not a single gene that would be responsible for this, but constellations of genes, networks of genes. The evidence so far suggests that there actually is a specific constellation of genes which not only give rise to psychic talent, but actually produce morphological changes in the body itself, which have not been noticed before, because you look at what is considered to be normal in the human body, it's actually a very wide range. So we don't know yet what is normal in the body, and we, at this point, have a suspicion that we did not all come out of a single ancestor in North Africa. We came out of probably a whole bunch of different original humans, and we're not all the same. We're close enough, so we're all considered human, but there are differences. And so one of those differences may be in a special talent for these kinds of abilities. So that's what we're trying to do. So yeah, so if you're interested in volunteering for the study, give your name to Tahiti and go from there. Yeah, midichlorians, well, that's what it was for the Jedis. I don't know if it'll come down to something like that, but perhaps. Yeah, we don't know. One of the things that is found that is very unexpected at this point is that you do an MRI of the brain of people of this sort. Their brains have sections that are different than the general population brain, which was shocking to find out that that was the case. It is unknown what these areas of the brain are about, and it's not public knowledge yet either that this is the case. So we don't know. We're right at the very beginning of trying to figure out, is there really some difference among people genetically and morphology of the people too. Is there an online source for parallel Greek and English of the Gnostic text? I don't know, but I'm sure Google can tell you pretty quick. Let's see. What's your prediction to where the research is going to go in the next 50 years? That's a good question. So I'm guessing And this is partially based on where physics is going, because ultimately the reason that science resists these kinds of ideas is based on two things. First of all, many scientists don't believe that these are repeatable effects. We know that they actually are, as I pointed out with my friend Jessica Utz. From a statistician point of view, there's no question that these are repeatable effects. So the second reason why many scientists don't like it is either they have a religious objection, so they believe it, they just don't want to have anything to do with it, or they believe that it's incompatible with physics. But if you look where physics is headed, and it's not only physics, it's the neurosciences as well now. In both domains, as you get deeper and deeper into the nature of physical reality itself, it begins to look a lot more like a pure informational construct. And from there to consciousness as something that is informational in some way, the gap is narrowing. And I think that gap will continue to narrow until at some point we're going to go back to this perennial philosophy idea that there's something very peculiar about consciousness. And there are already mathematicians who are trying to come up with ideas of how would you get from pure consciousness to manifest physicality, as we know. Or how does physics come out of nothing or come out of consciousness? Well, there are proposals on how you do that. And some of it at this point has to do with very abstract set theory. But I think eventually, I don't know if it's 50 years or next Tuesday or 3,000 years, but eventually we'll get to a point where I'm reasonably convinced that what we currently dismiss as supernatural type mental magic will become part of science. It'll be a very different science at that point. Like most of what we currently know about science will remain more or less the same, but there'll be whole new domains that science will expand as it always has. And just as alchemy became chemistry and so on, you'll have the natural magic or real magic that will become science, and then will turn into some kind of technology. And at that point, when we have a technology of magic, civilization as it currently exists cannot persist. And that's one of the other reasons why there's a huge suppression of the idea that magic is real. Because you don't need to, think about the way that civilization runs. It requires secrecy. Governments can't work unless they have secrets. And in this domain, there are no secrets. And just that alone would change society dramatically. The whole justice system would change. Everything would change. Alleged magic that has been solidly disproven. The actual research from a scientific perspective on magic is so thin. Like most of it is focused on very elementary forms of psychic ability. And so there we know that these elementary forms are real. Major magic, as if you think of it in terms of Harry Potter or the ways presented recently in Doctor Strange, we haven't been able to even begin to test all that stuff. So I wouldn't say it's disproven. I would say at this point we don't have any good explanation because we don't even know if it's real. Partially because magicians who can do that aren't so interested in working with scientists. Yeah, as Savage Torres says, imagine a world in which people cannot lie. That's a very different kind of world than the one we live in. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why people who are charged with maintaining the status quo, namely government, don't like magic at all. And it's why the topic itself is suppressed. You can go anywhere in the world and not be able to get an academic degree in magic, or for that matter, even in psychic phenomena. You can get non-accredited degrees probably, but not one of the 15,000 or so universities around the world can you get a degree in magic, which is a pity. Yes, you can get degrees in mythology. You can now get a degree in the esoteric traditions. You can get degrees in anthropology, focusing on beliefs in magic. You can't get a degree on magic itself. Yeah. So actually, in the academic world, you talk to most of the people involved in religious studies, they very deftly will avoid talking about whether or not the phenomena that they study, oftentimes supernatural events, they don't say whether they're real or not, because that's a taboo in the academic world. You're not allowed to talk about something like the miracle of Fatima as being an actual event. Psychological event is fine, but beyond that, you're simply not allowed to talk about it. Follow through on experiments with John Hagelin. The study of the magical force or the will of the mind. Well, I'm not sure which experiments you're talking about. I know John, and I know the kinds of experiments that the TM people have done, but I don't know that they would even think about them in terms of magical forces. As force of will, probably, or maybe intention, because they come out of a tradition where things like the siddhis, a yoga tradition, are certainly considered to be real. But I haven't studied these with John. So how can one get training in magic and psychic research? Yeah, you mostly learn on your own. One way is through universities like the one where I'm a professor, the California Institute of Integral Study in San Francisco, which has an online teaching program on integral and transpersonal psychology. So CIIS is an accredited university, same accreditation that you'd find at Stanford and other places. So there are a few universities, a handful in the United States, where mostly through online or non-residential training, you can learn about these traditions. Yep, Silva Mind Control, that's certainly about magic. In the World Conference with the Pathologists and Neurologists, but I'm not sure what that referred to. Ah, yes. Oh, of course. The ASIRE, the Nancy Zingroni and Carlos Alvarado library on Second Life is a very, very good resource. Parapsychology Foundation, yes. And of course, the institute where I work, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we have 7 scientists on staff, and this is the kind of research that we do. It's through our articles and books, which is the main way that we do outreach, and occasionally lectures like this. I haven't given a lecture on Second Life before, but I've gotten, so I forget how many, 300 or so in other contexts. Oh, I see. Yeah, so Tahiti is saying, referring to the conference participated in at the Science and Non-Duality Conference with Julia Mossbridge and John Hagelin and a few others. We are doing an experiment. It's not with John, but it's kind of along those lines. And most of the experiments we've done that are physics-oriented, which are looking at the influence of the intention on the physical world, for about the last 8 years, we've been using a double-slit optical system because it's such an elementary quantum system to use. And now we're beginning to work with entangled photons as a target. And the reason why entangled photons are an interesting target of mind-matter interaction is because entanglement, there's no classical analog to quantum entanglement. The effect works because of non-locality. It's this holistic nature of the quantum world. The effects are outside of space and time. And so we're using a physical system, namely entangled photons, which is in space and time, which allows us to experiment with it, but the connections are not in space-time. And that is exactly the strange thing about both psychic and magical phenomena. They don't operate in space-time. They manifest in space-time, otherwise we wouldn't see it, but the action is not happening in space-time. So we're using a physical system, part of which we know is operating not in space-time, to see if there's a relationship then between what the mind is doing and what is happening at that scale of reality. So that we're just about to begin that series of experiments. And we have colleagues in Paris who are doing the same experiments, who are both doing it independently, but we're working with each other to try to optimize the nature of the experiment itself. Eventually, about a year from now, we're going to put these experiments online. So that you'll be able to try to influence entangled photons over the internet as an experiment. That's about a year away from now. Okay, looks like we're over time, so I think I should stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dean. We are extremely lucky to have you today. You're such a busy person, but it's all for the good, I'm sure. And we can't wait to see the results of your new experience. And I know I learned a lot, for one, and am more enlightened on the topic. And I noticed, I wanted to also mention that I took you around yesterday to see some survey results I have next door in the pavilion on this level next to this event venue. And I'm taking an anonymous survey of what types of experiences you've experienced, and there's a simple yes and no voting machine that you can vote on. And I showed Dean the results yesterday, and he mentioned to me that they are all quite normal along the lines of the general public statistics that are out there. So if you want to participate in that, we've gotten almost 300 votes. And I find the results fascinating. As normal as Dean says they are, I still find them fascinating. It is the alarming number of people that experience this type of phenomena. And Dean, we have 6 volunteer names for you that are interested in receiving an application or contacting you. And I can give you a list of those names, and we can instant message those folks, and I can pass the information to them, or you can do that directly yourself or with help from Maggie. However that would work out, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, if I can get them offline by email, that would be best, because I'll forward them on to my research assistant.
Okay, I will do that. I don't have their real names. I only have their avatar names. So that's something they would probably want to do in private directly with either you or Maggie.
Okay, yeah, so the other way to do this then is send me an email, just dean@ions.org,
okay.
IONS.org, and then I'll get it directly that way.
Okay.
And now I've forgotten how to get off of the podium.
There's a little blue button.
Oh, I see. There we go.
There you go. Okay, I'll come up and chat with you for a couple of seconds unless you need to go. And we appreciate again your attending. And thank you all for coming. I'm glad that Dean had some folks to talk to, because I know everyone that came today is extremely interested in what he's studying. So thanks again for coming, and I'll be around for questions if you have more questions. And Maggie can help you with questions as well. And Dean, if you need to talk to me in private before you leave, that'd be great. And I will stand around for a little while. And thank you again for coming, and feel free to roam around the sim and check out the library. The library is, if you go out this building and hang a right, it's on the other end of this level, and there's a big building over there with all the videos and surveys in the very far end of that hallway, in the big dome. Thanks again all for coming.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.